Chapter 3, Stakeout. "We need a map," said Jessie. She and Maxwell were all at his house planning their stakeout. Tonight's New Year's Eve, for crying out loud. Luckily, it was early afternoon. There was still time if they worked fast. Maxwell had lots of drawing materials in his room. Paper, markers, colored pencils, rulers, protractors. He even had one of those big slanting desks that architects use to draw up their plans. It was perfect. Jessie climbed up on the tall stool and began to draw. There were only 4 houses within a mile of Grandma's house: the Uptons, Mrs. Lewis's, Maxwell's house, and the old Jansen house, which no one had lived in for years. Last summer, Jessie and Evan had looked in the windows, and the house was as empty as a seashell. So here's a map of the neighborhood. But people moved around, so Jessie asked, "Is anyone living in that old empty house?" Maxwell made a face. "That's where the Sinclairs live," he said. "They moved in right after me, but I was here first." Jessie wrote the Sinclairs house on her map. Then she called Maxwell over. Together they stared at the piece of paper. Jessie was pretty sure that Mrs. Lewis, who lived alone, hadn't taken the bell. Mrs. Lewis was close to 90 years old. There was no way an old lady like that could lift a 100-pound bell. The Uptons were good friends of Grandma's. They're the ones who had driven her to the hospital when she fell. The Uptons checked in on Grandma at least once a week, and Jessie's mom talked to them on the phone from time to time. "I don't think the Uptons took Grandma's bell," Jessie said. She pointed to the Sinclair house on the other side of the bridge. "What are they like? Do they have any kids?" "Mean boys," said Maxwell. He started rocking back and forth, taking that old half step, which with his right foot before shifting his weight back in his left. 2 of them. Mean boys. "What makes them mean?" asked Jessie, thinking back to the girls in her last year class who had played a rotten joke on her. Jessie felt her face go hot just remembering what they'd done. Maxwell shook his head. "Won't say it. Mean boys, both of them, mean." Jessie frowned. She needed Maxwell's help. If she was going to be Agent 99, she needed an Agent 86. Well, how old are they? Jeff's in 5th grade and Mike's in 4th. Maxwell's rocking was getting faster. Then he stopped rocking and started walking in circles, snapping the fingers on his right hand like he was cracking whip and making that strange puffing noise. They're not so big," said Jessie. But in her mind, she imagined boys that towered over her. Boys even taller than Evan, and he was one of the tallest boys in 4th grade. "They don't have to be big. They're mean," Maxwell said. "You keep saying that," Jessie pointed out. "Stop repeating yourself and sit down for Pete's sake. You're making a lot of noise." Sometimes Maxwell could be very distracting. Maxwell sat down on the edge of his bed, but he kept snapping his fingers and moving his feet back and forth quietly, blowing air through his lips. "Did you ever hear them talk about Grandma's bell?" Jessie asked. On the bus. Sorry. On the bus. They said they were going to take it." "Really?" said Jessie. "They really said that? Why didn't you tell me?" "You never asked. A person doesn't need to ask a question like that. A person should just know. And that's the kind of information you'd tell a secret agent. Honestly, sometimes she just didn't get Maxwell. He was a smart kid, but there were times when he acted like he had rocks in his head." "When did you hear them talking about Grandma's bell?" "Wednesday, December 8th at 2:23 p.m. Jessie stared at him. "How do you remember that?" Maxwell shrugged. Jessie wasn't sure if Maxwell was going to turn out to be a terrible spy or the best spy who ever lived. Either way, they had their suspects. And that meant it was spying time. Jessie pointed to the map. "That's where we need to go for the stakeout," she said. "We need to watch those boys, see what they do and where they hide their stuff." Nope, Maxwell said Maxwell. shaking his head. I'm not going there. They're mean boys. They'll never even see us. We'll hide in the woods, said Jessie. We'll need bino specs, though. Do you have any like that? I won't go, said Maxwell. I won't go. Fine, said Jessie. I'll go alone. Okay, Jessie shook her head. A friend is not supposed to make another friend go on a stakeout alone. You don't know anything about being a friend. Jessie thought of all the times Evan explained to her the rules for getting along with other kids. Now here she was explaining those rules to Maxwell. It felt weird. But it didn't matter much because Maxwell didn't seem to care one bit that she was calling him a bad friend. It seemed to Jessie that all he cared about was staying away from the Sinclair house. She thought for a minute and decided to try a different approach. I thought you said you were smart. I am, he said. Maxwell Smart. Well, if you're really Maxwell Smart, then tell me what you always say to the chief, Jessie started, talking in a deep voice that she hoped sounded like the chief on Get Smart. Maxwell, you'll be facing every kind of danger imaginable. Jessie waited for Maxwell to reply. She knew that Maxwell had memorized every line of dialogue in all 138 episodes of the show. Maxwell whispered his line so quietly Jessie couldn't hear it. Louder, she shouted. Maxwell, you'll be facing every kind of danger imaginable. And loving it, shouted Maxwell. He broke into a big grin. You see, it'll be fun. We'll be just like Agent 99 and Maxwell Smart. And we'll find the bell. We're not going to find the bell, said Maxwell. Don't be a pessimist, said Jessie, using one of her favorite big words. She headed for the door with the map in her hand. We need to find binoculars and flashlights and maybe some kind of a weapon. An hour later, they were crouched behind a clump of young pine trees that grew on the edge of the woods. In front of them lay the bridge that crossed Deer Brook, and behind that was the Sinclair's house, their barn, and more woods. Jessie stared through the binoculars they had borrowed from Maxwell's mom, but there wasn't much to see. She wished the binoculars were attached to a pair of eyeglasses like the bino specs on Get Smart, but there hadn't been time for that. We need to get closer, she said. Nuh-uh, said Maxwell, backing up slowly and bouncing a little. Without waiting for Maxwell to agree, Jessie started running toward the house in a crouched-over position, keeping as low to the ground as she could. It was hard going because the snow was still deep, but she was determined to see what was happening inside the house. When Jessie got to the porch steps, she scampered up and then pressed herself against the outside wall of the house. This, she thought, was the way a real agent would behave. She was good at this. It gave her a thrill to think she was about to spy on a real suspect of a real crime. She waited a minute without moving to see if Maxwell was going to follow her, but when she looked through her binoculars at the clump of pines she had just left, she could see that he was still there, hunkered down in the snow. What a scaredy cat. Of course, her own heart was pounding like a drum, but at least she had made it. How to make bino specs. On the porch. What should she do now? Continue with the spy mission or go back and get Maxwell? She thought about what the real Agent 99 would do, and she knew she didn't have a choice. Secret agents always stuck together. That was the whole point of having a partner. Jessie tiptoed off the porch and ran back to the clump of pines. She found Maxwell just as she had left him, squatting in the snow and rocking back and forth on his heels. You have to come right now, she said. No. Yes, I won't. You will. He closed his eyes and shook his head furiously. Maxwell Smart, you listen to me. You've got a mission to do, and you're going to do it. We're spies, and they're the enemy, and this is what spies do. We creep up on the enemy, and we spy. She grabbed the sleeve of Maxwell's coat, and Jessie couldn't believe it. He came along with her, just like that. He followed her across the yard and up the porch. In less than a minute, they were both pressed up against the wall with their heads just inches below the window. But when they dared to lift their heads and peek in, there was nothing to see. They were just staring at a regular old dining room. Silently, Jessie motioned with her hand for Maxwell to follow her. Crouched down, she crossed the porch to the window on the other side of the front door, and Maxwell came along right after her. Again, they slowly raised their heads to look inside the window and saw nothing. Just the living room with no one in it. Jessie sank down, pressing her back against the house. She looked at Maxwell, hoping he'd have a great idea, but he just looked like he wanted to go home. Spying was more difficult than Jessie had imagined. Suddenly, there was a clattering and banging. A clattering and banging noise inside the house. The front door flew open, and two boys in ski jackets and boots came charging out of the house onto the porch.